grandparents' birth certificate and so on. And lots of young people told me stories about how it would take 5 years, for example, to get an ID card. I understand that doesn't happen as much anymore, that now there are Nubian elders on the vetting committees, and the Nubian elders are able to verify that so-and-so person is a Kenyan Nubian, a Ugandan Nubian, and people can get their ID cards now without as much problems, or at least just the same problems that all Kenyans have with bribery and so on. People spoke this morning, and other people have said to me that that they're happy with this situation, that as long as people can get ID cards, the vetting is okay. The Kenyan government is allowed to check that they're giving ID cards to the right people. But I actually write in this chapter that I don't think that the vetting is okay. I think the solution at the moment is just an ad hoc solution. It's not safeguarded. If the government change their mind, they can kick the elders off the vetting committee and the old problems will come again. People will be sent to Nyayo House and so on. And there's no reason why Nubians should be vetted when Luos who live here or Kikuyus who live here, they don't get vetted. And actually, even though the vetting is working okay, it's still discrimination to vet particular people based on their tribe, not based on any particular concern that this person was born in Uganda. So what I say in that chapter is that if Nubians are to be properly equal with other Kenyan citizens, then they shouldn't be vetted at all. And it's the same for Somalis and the same for some Arabs on the coast and Ganjil and some other communities that also get vetted. They're getting vetted because the perception is that the Nubians are not indigenous to Kenya, and same with the Somalis and so on. And so that's basically what I write about in the ID card chapter. I set up this problem and say that the problem with ID cards has been a problem, it's starting to get better, but the solution is it's not good enough. There's still discrimination. And then in the next chapter about collective recognition, I explain the reason why the vetting still continues is to do with this problem of who is Indigenous and who is not Indigenous in Kenya. And that people who are thought not to be Indigenous, like the Nubians, not only do they get vetted for ID cards, but they also miss out on quotas for bursaries, quotas for the police, employment in the police and the civil service, the National Youth Service and the army. And that it's difficult. Most other tribes who are thought to be Indigenous, they have some small unit of their own. So maybe if they're a small tribe, they have like a ward or a district that they dominate, and then they can access more jobs, they can access the CDF funds and the bursaries and these things better because they've got their own people in the positions in that area. And groups who are not Indigenous don't have that benefit. And so I say, that this is a real problem, and that people being Indigenous, usually, this may be less interesting to you, but usually when people talk about Indigenous groups like the Aboriginals in Australia, they're talking about a very small group of people who get special treatment and they have a special kind of status in a country. But I think in Kenya, it's the opposite way around. That the normal people in Kenya are thought to be Indigenous, and that people who are not Indigenous are the minority and the ones who get treated differently. And so that's more interesting, I think, to other professors who study the idea of indigeneity, what it means to be Indigenous. But for what it's worth, I talk about that. And I talk about how the Nubians want to be recognised as the 43rd tribe, and that in the 2009 census the Nubians were counted, but it wasn't as the 43rd tribe, it was as code number 220. And I also talk about the origins of this idea of the 42 tribes. So many people think that it's in the constitution, maybe in the old one or the new one, or that it's in the Kenya Gazette, or that it's in some law, but it's actually not. There is no list of 42 tribes. It's just this idea that people have that comes from the 1962 and the 1969 censuses when they counted 42 tribes. And so when the Nubians asked to become the 43rd tribe, they're asking to be added to a list that doesn't exist. And so what I say is that actually this whole idea that Kenya is made up of only 42 tribes needs to be tackled, and it needs to be done away with. There are more or less than 42 tribes depending on which way you count it, and then having some kind of special list is maybe not very helpful. There's always going to be someone who's left off the list. Today it's the Nubians, maybe another day it will be some other group, but as long as you have this imaginary list, it causes problems of inclusion and exclusion that lead to problems, for example, with ID cards, or problems with quotas for employment. In this chapter, I try and explain all the reasons why the Nubians want land title for Kibera. And so I talk about things like physical security, which came up this morning. If there's inter-ethnic violence, then if the Nubians don't have some safe place that they can call their own, then they will be at risk if that happens. And it's happened in Kibera before. It's a genuine risk. And so it's important for that reason. I also say it's important because many Nubians rely on Kibera for their livelihood in the form of rental properties. That for many people, when their rental properties are destroyed or they're occupied by people who don't pay rent, that causes problems for people's household economies. But I also talk about how the Nubians invest meaning in Kibera, that it's your ancestral land. You're the only people who bury your dead just down the road here. No one else in Kibera does that. Everybody else gets shipped up in these matatus up country. That it was the Nubians who developed the land in the first place, right from sort of 1904, which is quite a long time ago, and that if people don't have places where they can practice their culture, there aren't very many places left. For example, to have a wedding. When I first came here, I went to a wedding at Wembley, but now Wembley is just full up of houses, and this I think is happening more and more. And if this keeps happening, then it's a threat to Nubian culture. And so I talk about all these reasons why the land is important. But I also say that the reason why I think the Nubians think land is important is because all the other tribes in Kenya also think land is important. So everyone has their rural home, they go back to their shags for Christmas, they go back for burials and weddings, and everyone has somewhere to call home. And if the Nubians don't have this, then where do they have? Well, they have nowhere else to go. And the problem here, I think, is not that the Nubians don't have anywhere else to go. The problem is that in Kenya, land doesn't belong to Kenyans, it belongs to small tribes. And that it's not so much a problem that the Nubians don't have Kibera, the problem is that you're not safe if you go somewhere else. And likewise, if a Kikuyu owns some property in the Rift Valley, they're not safe there. That's actually what the problem is. And that in the long term, Kenyans have to address this issue of ethnic homelands and ethnic territorialism and exclusivism, because it's dangerous for people, and it divides people. It divides Kenyans from each other, and it prevents people thinking of themselves as Kenyan. And so I sort of say that some sort of middle ground has to be arrived at, where people can recognise that the Nubians have a unique attachment to Kibera, but that the idea of exclusive land where other people are not allowed if they're not Nubian, that's not a good idea. And then I write about some of the ways in which some of the different Nubian groups themselves say that. They say we want this is the thing, I guess, is some Nubians who I spoke to did say they don't want to share the land with anyone else under any circumstances. And I tried to be honest about the fact that people say that, and that it's quite an exclusive and dangerous way of dealing with the land situation. And then I also talked about how some other Nubians had more inclusive ideas. For example, that the Nubians might have land title, but other people could continue to rent, they could continue to live here, they could continue to do business here, and that kind of thing. But I did also say that in general it's a problem that I don't think other people who live in Kibera really understand that the Nubians are willing to compromise in some ways, and that this culture of fear from other communities who live in Kibera, if the Nubians were to get land title, is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be dealt with. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And so that's basically what that chapter is about. My main aim in that chapter was to try and explain that as long as all other Kenyans have their own homeland, then it's not fair to deny the Nubians a homeland as well. But the better solution would be for people not to have homelands that don't welcome other people. So that was basically my argument there.